The wind bit like teeth across the frozen plain, its whistle high and cruel through the cottonwoods lining the half-iced creek. Jacob Turner kept his head low against the sting, scarf stiff with frost, reins tight in one gloved hand as his mare picked her way across the crusted snow. Early winter had settled in hard this year, weeks before the townfolk expected, and the sky looked ready to drop another load before nightfall. He needed to reach home before dark. The world out here didn't forgive stragglers. A sound cut through the gale, thin, broken, too raw to belong to the wind. Jacob reined in, the mare tossing her head, steam rising from her nostrils. He held still, ears straining. There it was again, a ragged cry, softer now, but it carried that note of human pain that no man could mistake. He scanned the whiteness, snow-draped brush, ice-rimmed creek, shadows lengthening across the drifts. Nothing. Then a flicker of movement, a hand, pale against the snow, trembling from behind a fallen log at the creek's bend. Jacob dismounted, boots sinking with a muffled crunch. The air smelled of iron, blood cutting sharp through the cold. He rounded the log and stopped. A woman lay half-buried in frost, black hair matted against her bruised face, dress torn and stiff with frozen blood. Against her chest, two small bundles stirred, thin cries escaping their cloth wrappings. Her lips moved, breath a ghostly wisp. "Please, take them. My last day alive. Wounds are fatal." Her voice cracked into silence, as if even words cost her what strength she had left. Jacob dropped to one knee, gut tightening at the sight. She couldn't have been more than 27, her features fine, eyes slanted yet wide with pain, skin bleached pale beneath bruises. The babies squirmed weakly, their tiny fists poking from threadbare cloth. He touched her shoulder. Heat flared beneath the chill. Fever. His jaw clenched. He had seen cattle near death, men too, but something in the desperate curve of her arms around those children hit deeper. He wanted to look away. He couldn't. Boot prints scarred the snow nearby. Deep, staggered, more than one set. Jacob traced them with his eyes, the trail running back toward the timber ridge. Men had come this way, left her bleeding, and gone on. Maybe they'd be back. He scanned the ridgeline. Nothing moved but the drifting snow, yet the back of his neck prickled. He had a choice. Mount up, ride hard for safety, leave this woman to the frost like the others surely had. Or lift her, burden himself with her and two babes in a storm that already threatened his own survival. The babies whimpered again, a sound so frail it seemed stitched from the wind itself. Jacob cursed under his breath, a word lost in the gust, then stripped his coat from his shoulders and wrapped it over the three of them. He slid his arms beneath her body, light as kindling, stiff where blood had dried, and lifted her with the children pressed between. Her head lolled against his chest. She moaned faintly, voice thick with pleading. "Don't let them go back." "I won't," he muttered, though he hadn't planned to speak at all. The words felt carved from something older than decision. He staggered back to the mare, heaving the woman and her twins across the saddle before swinging up behind. The horse shifted under the extra weight, snorting, but Jacob pressed his knees, steadying her. He cast one last look at the footprints leading into the trees. Tracks of at least 3 men, heavy boots, dragging something, maybe her. He spat into the snow. Whoever they were, they'd left her for dead. Maybe they thought she'd already be gone. Maybe they didn't care. He leaned low, urging the mare into motion. Snowflakes thickened, spinning through the air like ash, stinging his face as they cut across the flats toward his cabin 3 miles on. The woman groaned softly, fingers twitching against his arm as if trying to cling even in her weakness. Jacob kept one hand on the reins, the other bracing her and the bundles tight. The baby's cries weakened, dwindling to soft hiccups. Their warmth seeped faint through his coat, a fragile reminder that life still fought within them. The storm rose quick. Wind drove sideways, filling the world with white blur. Landmarks vanished. Jacob steered by memory. The dips of the land, the leaning shape of a dead oak he knew stood near the halfway rise. The mare strained, hooves slipping on icy patches, steam rolling from her flanks. Jacob muttered steadying words, low and rough, though not meant for the horse alone. He felt the woman's shallow breaths against his arm. Each one sounded like it could be her last. Minutes stretched to an hour in the storm's chokehold. The world narrowed to the fight for each step forward. Snow clung to Jacob's lashes, froze his beard stiff. His muscles screamed from holding the weight, but he didn't loosen his grip. At last, through the swirling white, the shadow of his cabin emerged, timbers stark against drifts, smoke barely puffing from the chimney where the morning fire must have died low. Relief hit him sharp as pain. He dismounted quick, half-sliding with his burden, boots breaking through crust into knee-deep snow. He kicked open the door with his heel, stumbled inside, and the sudden quiet struck him, the muffled thump of wind against walls, the faint crack of frost in the timbers. He laid the woman on his narrow bed, unwrapped his coat, and freed the crying bundles. The cabin smelled of cold ashes and old pine, but within it there was shelter. He dropped to his knees, breath ragged, hands trembling from more than cold. The woman's eyes fluttered open, pupils clouded with fever. She tried to speak, lips shaping words he couldn't catch. Then she coughed, blood bright against the pallor of her mouth. Jacob fetched the tin cup, poured from the water bucket, lifted her head and let her sip. Her throat worked, then she fell back, chest rising shallow. He pressed cloths from his trunk against her wounds, slashes along her ribs, ugly bruising. Pike marks, he thought bitterly. Men had done this. Not chance, not accident. Men. The twins stirred, their small cries sharp in the close air. Jacob unwrapped them one by one, both tiny, faces pinched from cold, yet alive. He found scraps of rag and dipped them in warm water from the kettle, letting drops wet their lips. They sucked weakly, and some color returned. He wrapped them in his spare shirts, thick wool too big but warmer than torn cloth. He set them close to the fire, adjusting the wood until flames leapt bright. The woman turned her head toward the children, lips twitching in the faintest smile. Then her gaze fixed on Jacob, heavy with a plea she couldn't voice. He met it, silent, understanding in the weight of her eyes what words had already made plain out on the snow. She expected to die. She wanted him to keep them safe. His throat tightened. He had no wife, no family save for the land he worked, no knowledge of tending infants beyond what instinct might grant. Yet he could not shake the feel of them in his arms, the tiny weight, the desperate sound of their hunger. Already they had bound themselves to him. The fire crackled, shadows dancing against the log walls. Outside, the storm raged harder, snow slamming against the roof. Jacob sat back, muscles aching, eyes locked on the bed where life and death balanced fragile. The cabin felt too small for the decision that had already been made in his gut. He knew this storm wasn't the only one pressing down. Somewhere beyond the trees, the men who left her bleeding might circle back. If they did, they'd be coming for what she carried, and what he now swore to protect. The woman's lips moved again. He leaned close. Her breath was warm against his cheek, carrying the faintest whisper, "Don't let them take the twins." Then her eyes closed, lashes trembling against pale skin. Jacob pulled the blanket higher over her shoulders, heart pounding with something sharper than fear. He glanced at the fire, at the two small bundles nestled beside it, then back at the storm rattling his door. He knew what was coming. This was only the beginning. The fire caught slow that evening, snapping reluctantly as Jacob stacked fresh pine into its mouth. Smoke curled through the cabin, bitter and sharp, until the draft took it up the chimney. The warmth spread inch by inch, a thin shield against the winter night pressing against the log walls. He moved without noise, careful of every sound, aware of the fragile breaths behind him. The woman lay where he'd set her, head lolling against a pillow of bundled hides, skin sheened with sweat though the cold still clung to the room. Her wounds had bled less since he bound them with strips torn from his old work shirt, yet every rise of her chest seemed a hard-earned battle. He didn't know her name, didn't know if she'd wake to give it. All he knew was that she'd begged him to keep her children. The weight of that plea hadn't eased since he carried her in. The twins shifted in their swaddles near the hearth, mewling softly. One found its fist and sucked, eyes fluttering open, dark as polished stone. The other squirmed, mouth rooting for food that wasn't there. Jacob knelt, his shadow stretching over them, and felt a jolt of unease. He could mend a fence blindfolded, break a wild colt with patience, mend his own wounds when need demanded, but these lives were too small, too fragile. His hands, calloused and rough, looked made for tools, not cradling such tiny things. Still, he reached. He scooped one child against his chest, careful as though lifting spun glass. The warmth bled through his shirt, the rapid heartbeat thudding against his ribs. The infant whimpered, then stilled, face pressed into the hollow of his collarbone. Jacob sat back on his heels, awkward, stiff, but unwilling to put the child down. Something inside him shifted with the weight of that small trust. Behind him, the woman stirred. A low groan escaped her throat, followed by a whisper of a hum, a tune faint and wandering, carried on breath too thin to last. Jacob glanced over. Her eyes cracked open, the dark irises dulled with fever, yet fixed on him. On the child in his arms. The hum broke into a cough, but he recognized the intent. The lullaby wasn't for him. It was for them. For the lives she guarded even as her own slipped further away. He shifted closer to her, lowering himself onto the edge of the bed. "They're alive," he said, voice low, gruff from silence. "They're warm now." He wasn't sure if she caught the words, but her lashes trembled, and the faintest ghost of a smile touched her lips. Her gaze drifted to the firelight, to the second twin fussing on the floor. Jacob set the first back into the basket and reached for the other. This one cried louder, voice cracking like a frail reed. He searched his shelves until he found an old rag, dipped it into the pan of warmed goat's milk he'd kept for winter cooking. Twisting the cloth into a point, he pressed it gently to the infant's lips. The child latched, sucking greedily. Jacob felt his chest tighten again, a knot of relief and awe he didn't voice. The woman's eyes closed, lids fluttering, but her breathing eased for a spell. Jacob fed each twin in turn, rocking them until the cries dwindled to hiccuping silence. The fire threw a soft glow across their faces, so small, so undeserving of the cruelty that had driven them to his doorstep. He sat in the half-light long after, staring at the flames, listening to the storm scream outside. When at last he dragged himself up, he added another log to the fire, then moved to the door. He set the bar firm across it. His rifle leaned nearby, oiled and ready. Tracks in the snow still haunted his memory. He had no illusions about the kind of men who left a woman bleeding in the cold. They might yet return. And if they did, he'd be the only wall between them and what lay inside this cabin. The hours passed slow. Wind battered the shutters, rattled the roof, filled the silence with its endless howl. Jacob dozed in the chair, rifle across his knees, waking at every shift of the woman's breath, every whimper from the twins. He moved without complaint, without thought of sleep. Something had rooted him here, in this vigil. Toward dawn, the storm broke into a soft drizzle of flakes. Pale light seeped through cracks in the shutters. Jacob stepped outside, breath fogging in the bitter air, and split wood until his arms burned, stacking it high against the cabin wall. The work steadied him, gave his restless unease somewhere to go. When he came back inside, warmth rushed to meet him, the smell of smoke and milk heavy in the air. The woman was awake. Not fully, but more than before. She turned her head as he entered, eyes following him with weary awareness. Jacob paused, uncomfortable beneath that gaze, then busied himself with the fire. She rasped something, soft, broken syllables he couldn't catch. He turned back. "What?" Her lips shaped it again, slower. "Thank you." The words scraped raw, but they carried weight that struck him deep. He gave a small nod, throat thick, and sat across from her. He didn't ask her story. Not yet. She needed strength before words. Still, her gratitude carried more than politeness. It held fear too, and surrender, the kind only born when a person knew their life now belonged to another's choice. The twins stirred again. Jacob rose, fed them as before, careful and deliberate. The woman watched, silent, eyes glimmering faint. For a time, nothing more passed between them but the quiet tasks of survival. His hands grew steadier each time he lifted the children, each time he soothed their cries. By mid-morning, he could hold one against his chest and rock them while stoking the fire with his free hand. It wasn't grace, but it was something. Later, when the cabin glowed with firelight against the dimming day, Jacob sat by the bed, rough fingers rubbing his brow. The woman's voice, faint but clearer than before, drifted to him. Their names. She paused, breathing shallow. Sean. May. He looked up. She met his eyes, fragile but steady, as though she knew this gift might be the last she could offer. Jacob repeated the names under his breath, letting them anchor themselves in his mind. Sean. May. He nodded once, and she closed her eyes again, exhaustion winning. The sound of knocking startled him upright. Not loud, 3 raps against wood, sharp and deliberate. Jacob's hand found the rifle. The woman stirred, eyes flashing wide with terror before he hushed her. He crossed the cabin, lifted the bar, and cracked the door. A gust of snow swept in around the shape of an older man, wrapped in a ragged coat, beard bristled with frost. "Evenin', Jacob," Jed Carter rasped, stomping snow from his boots. His gaze swept the cabin, caught on the woman and the bundled twins. His brows furrowed. "Heard some hell's been riding these parts. Gang out of Pike's outfit. Lookin' for something they think belongs to 'em." Jacob's jaw tightened. "They came this far?" "Tracks near the ridge. Word in town says they aim to scour the countryside till they find what they're after." Jed's eyes softened as they lingered on the bed. "Guess I see what that is." Jacob didn't answer. The fire popped between them. Jed shook his head, voice low. "Careful, son. Men like Pike don't forgive theft. And they sure as hell don't forgive witnesses." The warning hung in the cabin long after Jed left, the door barred once more. Jacob stood staring at the wood, rifle heavy in his grip. Behind him, the twins whimpered, and the woman whispered their names again, as if trying to remind the room of what was at stake. Jacob turned back, his face carved with resolve. The fire painted him in shades of gold and shadow. He walked to the bed, lowered himself beside her, and though no promise left his lips, it was there in the silence between them. He would not let them be taken. And outside, in the thinning snow, faint tracks marked where Jed had come, and where others might soon follow. The snow thinned over the next days, but the cold deepened, settling into the ground and into bones. Each dawn broke gray, with frost climbing the inside corners of the window panes and silence hanging so heavy it seemed the world itself had stopped breathing. Jacob kept the fire alive with stubborn vigilance, splitting logs until his arms ached, carrying water from the creek with steam rising off the buckets. He moved through each task with the same focus he gave to fencing or calving season, but his eyes drifted often to the bed where the woman lay, her strength flickering like a lantern flame in wind. She stirred more now. Her fever rose and fell, sweat soaking the hides, but sometimes she woke long enough to speak. Not in long stories, not in the kind of sentences Jacob could rest in, but in fragments, broken images that he pieced together like a map scorched in fire. "My husband," she whispered once, voice brittle, "died a crossing." Her gaze had fixed on the rafters above, as if she saw the memory written there. "River took him. I had nothing." Another time, when the twins slept and the fire hummed low, she touched the scar on her temple, fingers trembling. "Traitors found me. Pike." The name fell like a stone into the quiet. Her lips pressed thin, as if it hurt to shape even that much. Jacob said nothing. He kept his hands steady, wringing a cloth in warm water, wiping sweat from her forehead. But inside, heat surged that had nothing to do with the fire. He'd heard of Harlan Pike. Everyone in these parts had. Pike traded furs and hides when it suited him, whiskey and flesh when it didn't. The law turned its head because Pike's men carried rifles and silver enough to grease hands. Jacob had never crossed him. Few dared. But now Pike's shadow stretched across this cabin, across 2 tiny lives asleep in a basket by the hearth. One evening, as wind scoured the plains outside and the fire painted the logs gold, she said more. Her words came halting, as though each one had to climb through pain. "He kept me for labor, for what I was." Her eyes met Jacob's then, dark and unflinching. "When I bore children, he said they were his. Said they'd fetch price enough. I ran before he could sell them." Jacob's jaw worked, a muscle jumping near his ear. He wanted to speak, to say she was safe now, but the words stuck. Promises were heavy, And the kind of men Pike bred didn't let go of what they claimed. Still, he reached across, set the back of his hand against her forehead, and let that quiet act be his vow. The twins stirred at her voice, tiny mews rising, and she turned toward them, the softest expression washing her face. She lifted a trembling hand, and Jacob, seeing her weakness, brought the closest child to her. She cradled Sean against her chest, lips brushing the child's downy hair, whispering in a tongue Jacob didn't know. May wriggled in the basket, fists batting the air, and Jacob scooped her up, awkward but firmer now than in those first nights. For a long while, the four of them sat in that circle of firelight. 2 children, a mother clinging to the edge of life, and a man who hadn't meant to become their keeper. The days took on a rhythm. Jacob rose before light, checked the traps he'd set in the timber, split wood, mended tools. The woman, whose name he finally learned one afternoon, Lien, she whispered when he asked, mustered strength in small measures. She began sitting upright for moments at a time, enough to hush the children with a hum. Her voice, though frail, wrapped the cabin in something gentler than the storm winds outside. Jacob found himself listening, not for meaning, but for the shape of it, as though the melody itself stitched some unseen wound inside him. But winter wasn't the only thing pressing in. On the 4th morning since Jed's warning, Jacob rode to the ridge to check his snares. Snow lay untouched in wide stretches, the silence broken only by crows calling from naked branches. But as he rounded a stand of juniper, he found prints, deep, fresh, crossing his line. Too many for deer. Boot tracks, heading west toward his land. His stomach tightened. He knelt, tracing the shape with a gloved hand. 6, maybe 7 men. Heavy rifles by the drag of the heels. They weren't hunting game. That evening, when he returned, Lien was awake, the twins asleep in their basket. He set his rifle aside, shoulders taut. "Pike's men," he said, his voice low. "They're combing the ridge." Her face blanched. She clutched the blanket to her chest. "They'll come," she whispered. Jacob poured water into the basin, not looking at her. "Let them. Cabin's strong. I've weathered worse than wolves." Her eyes burned at him. "Wolves don't claim children." The words hit him harder than a blow. He turned, meeting her gaze. For the first time since he'd carried her in, he saw the depth of her fear not as weakness but as ferocity, the terror of a mother who knew what waited if Pike found them. He nodded once, sharp. "Then we'll be ready." From that night on, Jacob's movements carried a new edge. He barred the door twice over, stacked firewood against the shutters, checked and rechecked the rifle. He laid out the revolver he hadn't touched in years and placed it on the table near the bed. When Lien saw it, she shook her head, murmuring, "I cannot." "You might have to," he answered, voice hard but steady. He guided her hand around the grip. She trembled, but her fingers closed. For a moment she looked at him, eyes wide with something close to shame. He said nothing more, only showed her where to point, how to hold, how to breathe. She listened, silent, tears streaking down her cheeks, but she did not let go. Between preparations, life found quiet corners. Jacob rocked Sean by the fire while Lien soothed May with her humming. Sometimes she told him fragments of her childhood, green fields in Guangdong, the taste of lychee fruit, her mother's hairpin carved from jade. She spoke of it like someone describing a country she'd never see again, eyes shining with both longing and grief. Jacob listened without interruption, storing each image as though it were an heirloom entrusted to him. The bond between them deepened not through grand gestures but in the rhythm of shared survival. She began to trust the steadiness in his silence, the way he never flinched from the cries of the children, the way he shouldered the work without complaint. He, in turn, found himself watching the fragile strength in her, the way she fought to rise each day, the way her hands, though frail, still moved first toward her children before herself. But the threat never lifted. One afternoon, while cutting wood near the edge of the timber, Jacob spotted smoke on the horizon. Not his chimney, not Jed's, too far east. A campfire, or more than one. He stood still, axe in hand, breath fogging. His land was no longer hidden. That night, as the cabin glowed and the twins slept soundly, he told her. She held them tighter, rocking as if her arms alone could shield them from the world. "He won't stop," she said, voice breaking. "Pike won't stop until he has them." Jacob looked at the flames, jaw like stone. 4 years, he'd lived with no cause but the land, no reason beyond his own survival. But now, listening to her words, watching the curve of her body bent over the children, he felt the iron in him harden into something sharper. The wind shifted outside, carrying the faint echo of horses across frozen ground. Jacob froze, listening. It came again, distant, but there. He moved to the window, peering through the frost. Against the pale moonlit snow, a shape crested the far ridge. A rider. Then another. Shadows multiplying, moving slow but deliberate, cutting toward his land. He lowered the curtain, heart pounding, and turned to the cabin's small circle of light. Lien looked up at him, eyes wide, arms wrapped around her children. She didn't ask. She didn't need to. Jacob reached for the rifle, checked the chamber, and set it within arm's reach of the door. The fire hissed, sparks popping into the dark. The air grew thick with the weight of what was coming. He knew then the storm outside had only been a prelude. The real storm was riding in with men who claimed ownership of what no man had a right to own. And it was nearly upon them. The night held its breath. Jacob sat by the fire, rifle resting across his knees, eyes fixed on the door though the storm outside masked nearly every sound. Lien rocked one twin in her arms, the other nestled against her side, both swaddled in layers of rough cloth. The wind moaned around the cabin, pushing snow through the smallest cracks. Inside, the air carried the scent of pine smoke and iron oil from Jacob's rifle. Every creak of timber made the room feel smaller, tighter. Then it came, the muffled crunch of hooves over packed snow, faint but undeniable. Jacob rose in one smooth motion, stepping to the window, brushing frost with the back of his hand. Shapes moved through the dark. Men on horseback, lantern light bobbing against the night. Not one or two. A half-dozen, at least. His gut clenched as he counted the flickers. 7. Exactly what he'd feared. Lien's gaze followed him, eyes wide. Her voice trembled, but she kept it low. "Pike." Jacob turned, nodding once. He moved to the hearth, pulled the revolver from the table, and set it within her reach. "Keep it close. You point, you breathe, and you pull. Nothing more." Her hand hovered, shaking, before she touched the weapon. She gave no promise, only pressed the twins tighter to her side. Jacob didn't waste another word. He checked his rifle, slid cartridges into his belt, and stepped to the door. The knock came heavy, fist against wood, bold and without fear. A voice followed, gravel, laced with a sneer that carried through the storm. "Turner, open up. You got something belongs to me." Jacob stood silent, hand firm on the bar. The firelight painted his jaw in harsh lines, his breath steady despite the weight pressing on his chest. The knock came again, harder. "I know she's in there. I know you got the brats too. Hand 'em over, and maybe I let you keep your skin." The babies stirred, their small cries piercing the heavy quiet. Lien hushed them, tears streaking down her cheeks as she rocked them close. Jacob's grip on the rifle tightened. He drew a long breath, then answered, voice low but iron-hard. "Ain't yours. Never was." Laughter spilled through the door, cruel and cold. "You think you can hide behind timber walls? We'll burn you out if we have to." Jacob slid the bar from the door with a sharp crack and swung it open. Wind and snow burst in, carrying the sight of Pike himself astride a dark horse, lantern light catching his scarred face. 6 men fanned out behind him, rifles slung, eyes sharp with hunger. Jacob stepped onto the porch, rifle raised, snow stinging his face. The firelight spilled from behind, casting him in shadow. "You got 2 choices," Pike called, voice rising over the gale. "Give me the woman and her spawn, or I'll take this shack apart till I find him." Jacob leveled the rifle. His voice carried clear, stripped of anything but truth. "Only way you take them is over my dead body." For a heartbeat, silence reigned. Then Pike grinned, teeth flashing in the dark. "So be it." He jerked his hand, and the first shot cracked through the storm. The bullet splintered wood inches from Jacob's head. Jacob answered in kind, firing once, clean and fast. One rider pitched backward, rifle dropping into the snow. Chaos erupted. The storm swallowed sound, muffling the roar of gunfire to dull thuds, but the flashes lit the night. Jacob fired again, ducking behind the porch post as wood splintered around him. He worked the lever smooth, muscle memory guiding him. Another outlaw fell, clutching his side. Horses screamed. Men shouted curses into the wind. Inside, the twins wailed, the sound slicing through the thunder of guns. Lien pressed herself against the wall, revolver clutched in one hand, heart hammering so loud she thought it might give her away. Her eyes never left the doorframe, waiting for the moment the storm outside spilled in. Jacob dropped to one knee, reloaded quick, then swung out. Pike himself fired, grazing Jacob's shoulder, spinning him half around. Pain flared hot, but Jacob steadied, teeth gritted, and answered with a shot that took another man from his saddle. Snow churned red where he fell. The gang wavered, their numbers shrinking, but Pike's roar pulled them back. "Burn it! Burn him out!" Two men leapt from their saddles, torches lit from lantern flame. Jacob's stomach lurched. Flame against dry would mean death for all inside. He surged forward, leaving the porch, snow up to his knees, charging before they could reach the walls. He slammed into the first, rifle but cracking against his jaw, dropping him into the drift. The second swung his torch, fire arcing, but Jacob caught his wrist, twisting until bone popped. The torch fell into snow, hissed out, leaving only smoke. Jacob jammed the barrel of his rifle against the man's chest and fired point-blank. From the shadows, Pike advanced, pistol in hand. He fired. Jacob dove, rolling into the snow, breath ripped from him. The shot grazed his side, hot blood spilling under his coat. Pike's boots crunched closer. "You think you can play hero, Turner? You're just a boy trying to fight men." Jacob pushed to his knees, snow clinging to his beard, rifle lost somewhere in the drift. He drew his knife instead, steel flashing in the stormlight. Pike lunged, pistol swinging like a club, catching Jacob across the jaw. Stars burst behind his eyes. He staggered but didn't fall. Pike swung again. This time Jacob caught his arm, wrenched it, and the pistol fell. They grappled, fists and steel, rolling in the snow as the storm howled. Inside, Lien could hear it. The thud of bodies, the growl of men locked in struggle. She rose, trembling, setting the twins into their basket by the fire. Her hand tightened on the revolver. Every instinct screamed to stay hidden, but another voice whispered louder. He was bleeding for her children. She could not let him die alone. Pike drove Jacob onto his back, knife flashing toward his throat. Jacob caught his wrist, the blade hovering inches from skin, their breath mingling in white puffs. Pike's grin twisted. "They'll never be yours. They'll fetch a fine price, after I kill you." A gunshot split the night. Pike's body jerked. For a moment, his grin froze, then slackened. Blood bloomed across his chest. He crumpled sideways into the snow. Lien stood in the doorway, revolver clutched in both hands, smoke curling from its barrel. Her whole body shook, but her eyes burned steady. The storm swirled around her, hair whipping loose, firelight behind framing her like something both fragile and fierce. Jacob dragged himself upright, breath heaving, blood streaking his coat. He met her gaze, and no words were needed. The surviving men faltered, their leader gone, two more dead in the drifts. One shouted, "Fall back!" and they scrambled into the dark, horses thrashing, retreat swallowed by snow. The storm devoured their shapes until only silence remained, broken by Jacob's ragged breathing and the soft wail of the twins. Jacob staggered to his feet, knife still in hand, then dropped it into the snow. He turned toward the cabin, steps heavy. Lien lowered the revolver, tears cutting clean lines down her face. When he reached her, she steadied him with one arm, though her strength barely matched half his weight. He let her, shoulders sagging, exhaustion crashing over him. Inside, the cabin glowed with warmth. The twins whimpered, then settled as Lien bent to gather them, cradling both against her chest. Jacob slumped into the chair, pressing his hand to his side, watching her through the haze of pain. She moved slowly, but her eyes held new fire. She had fought, she had stood, and something in her had shifted. For a long moment, the only sounds were the crackle of the fire and the soft breath of the children. Then Jacob spoke, voice hoarse, words edged with both weariness and promise. "They're safe. You're safe. And as long as I'm standin', that won't change." Lien looked at him, lips trembling, then lowered her gaze to Sean and May. She bent her head, whispering words in her language, a prayer, a vow. When she lifted her eyes again, the fear was still there, but it had found its partner in resolve. Jacob leaned back, letting the warmth seep into him, letting the storm rage outside. He felt the ache of every wound, the weight of what had passed, but also the strange, fierce calm of knowing he had not faltered. The dawn came slow, pale light bleeding across snowdrifts glittering like shards of glass. Jacob stood in the doorway, one arm wrapped in bandages, the twins bundled close against his chest. Lien stood beside him, her face pale but steady. Together, they looked out over the frozen land, scarred now with the bodies of men buried in snow, yet shining with a promise of survival. The storm had taken much, but it had also bound them. Jacob glanced at her, the faintest smile breaking his bruised face. She met it with one of her own, small but real. For the first time, the world beyond the door didn't feel so empty. And just beyond the horizon, though neither spoke it aloud, lay the certainty that Pike's death would not be the end. More storms would come. But tonight, in the hush of early winter, they had endured.